The front and the back panels of your sewing machine cover are now sewn up. We're now going to get them put together to make your cover. So let's grab our sewing machines and just see how things are fitting. Now I've given the top edge here of your sewing machine cover a 2 cm seam allowance. So this is just to give you a bit of room to work things out. So just start off by just putting your sewing machine back and front panels right sides together, and then 2 cm down, just pin the 2 layers together, and then we'll flip that round. Oops. Pop it on our sewing machine and just check how it fits. So I've pinned that together 2 cm down from the top edge. I can just flip that round now and drape it over the top of my machine to see how we're looking. And that looks pretty good actually, I'm quite happy with that. And we will in a minute, we will make a hole up here for the handle to poke through, but just for the time being, let's make sure that's sitting nice and flat. And let's take a look at the overall fit of the machine cover. So what I want is at the bottom here, I don't want it to be puddling on the floor like this. I don't want it to have any excess, but equally I don't want it to be sort of floating up here either. Just want it to be grazing the floor. Leave yourself a bit of room because we might just trim off a little bit of the bottom there just to give ourselves a nice clean edge to attach our binding to. So I'll just check at the back as well. And that is a really lovely, a really nice fit for my sewing machine. So quite happy with that. The length as well, the width there across the machine is nice and covers the machine nicely widthways, so I'm happy to carry on. Now if you found that your machine cover didn't quite look right, let's say that it was a little bit on the short side and you wanted to make it longer, you've got a 2 cm seam allowance up here. You can just reduce some of that seam allowance at the top, maybe just sew it with a 1.5 or a 1 cm seam allowance at the top there. Let's say on the other hand that it was a bit too long, you overcompensated and it doesn't look quite right. Let's say that your machine cover is kind of draping on the floor there and it's going to pick up all the fluff and also it just doesn't look very nice, especially when you've got things in the pockets. Then what you can do is you can increase that 2 cm seam allowance by however much is needed until you get the perfect fit. So you've got your 2 cm seam allowance there to play with. If your machine cover's a little short, then increase at the top to allow it to sit nicely. If it's a little the other direction, then you can increase the seam allowance here. What you don't want to do is correct things by chopping off a bit from the bottom, because if you chop off a bit from the bottom here, then what you'll do is miss out on your pocket space and the proportions won't look so good. And by just doing all your adjustments via this seam at the top here, then you are doing the same to the back and the front, keeping both back and front panels exactly the same. And that will mean that your handle space, which is going to be about here, is also going to be in the, the right place. If you just chopped some off the back, then that seam there would be kicked towards the back, or if you chop some off the front, it'd be kicked towards the front, and you want to keep that quite central. So just pin your sewing machine cover together, pop it onto your sewing machine and check. Make any adjustments that you need to make via this seam allowance up here. If it's too wide this way, then you can trim down just a little bit. You can either, judge what you need to do. You could either just trim this side, or you could half what needs to be trimmed down and trim down off both sides. But do bear in mind that we are probably going to skim a little bit off either edge before we apply the binding, just to give ourselves a nice clean edge. So bear that in mind as well. So that said, we're all ready now to move on to the next step. So the next thing that I want to consider is the position of my handle here. So I can just flip that fabric back and take off the central pins that I've popped in there. Flip it back over. So we've got a gap now. And let's just see. So if that cover is sitting centrally, then my handle is kind of starting about there and it's finishing about there. Let's take out that pin as well. So I'll just put a clip to mark it so I can see that when that sewing machine cover is sat on, that gap there is plenty big enough for my handle, and it's also sitting in the right place there. So just because your handle for your sewing machine may not be in the centre, it might be offset, because they balance the handle according to the weight of the machine, and of course you've got more weight where the engine is, so it doesn't always follow that the handle for your machine is dead central. So don't think that you can just put a handle hole in the middle. You might have to offset it slightly towards the back side of the machine. So have a look where the handle is. I can see mine's there, and just pop a clip as a marker on your panel there as well, or you can use a chalk mark, whichever you find easier. So I've marked on the position for my hole for my handle there with those clips. So I put my back and right panels right sides together, and don't forget, of course, that the pockets go at the bottom, so it's the top you're sewing up. Make sure that your print is facing in the right direction. And then what I can do is just pin together these two layers, so match everything up nicely, match up those raw edges, keep everything true and square, and then I'm just going to pin this together. I'll pin it this way because I'm going to sew it. I'll pin it together even at the hole just to keep the fabric together, although I'm not going to sew between those two clips. There we go. So we're now ready to sew this together with a 2 cm seam allowance. We're going to start here, come and back stitch at this clip, and then start again here with a back stitch and sew all the way to the end, leaving a gap here. I'll start with a back stitch. My raw edges are matched up with my number 20 line, which is 20 millimeters or 2 centimeters. And I will just sew to my first clip, which I can see that's just beyond that stitch line there. Do a back stitch. And then I shall come down to the next clip. So that's in between those two stitch lines there. Line up with my 2 cm seam allowance, back stitch. And then continue to the end. So there's my stitch line there, and you can see that I've got my gap for my handle. I'll just open my machine cover out, and I will just press that seam allowance open and flat, including the area that I didn't stitch. Got a nice little row of ladies' heads looking at me. Hello. And now we'll repeat the same process with our lining. So I've got my 2 lining panel pieces here, which are the same size as my main panel pieces. Obviously this is simpler, you don't have any pockets on these, and you don't have any quilting or anything like that. So just put these 2 together, right sides together, and these don't have a direction either, they can go either way. So you're going to put those 2 right sides together and pin them together and sew them together with a 2 cm seam allowance. But we do need to match up so that we're going to leave the gap in the same place. What we need to bear in mind is that this will eventually sit, whoops daisy, wrong sides together like this. So there you go. That will sit there like that, and that will sit there like that, and that will make the lining for our cover. So lay things out like this, and that's how we can mark on the position of the handle hole. Don't mark it on from the right side, because then when you flip things over, it will, because it's offset and it's not in the centre, when you flip it over it will kind of go to the other side. A bit of a brain teaser, but just if you look at the back side of your machine cover, and then we can just match it up from here, and then we know where our gap needs to end up. So let's mark that up with a couple of clips again. So here's the beginning of my sewing machine handle gap there, and the reason why I don't mark this on the pattern to begin with is just because all sewing machines are slightly different, and we're making this to fit your particular machine. There's the end of my handle gap there. So I know where that needs to be now. And you could either equally mark that on just by snipping or adding a chalk mark. So we'll put these right sides together now. And I know that that's where my gap needs to be. So matching up those edges, making sure everything is nice and true, nice and square. Once again, I'll put a pin even in the area where I'm not going to sew, just to keep everything together. And then we're going to sew just as we did before. Sew this bit and this bit, leaving a gap here. So lining up my raw edge with my 2 centimetre seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning there. And a back stitch there again. It might actually help to chalk mark this, actually, be a bit more accurate. So that's all sewn together. Open it up, and then once again you just want to press that open and flat. We've got our 2 panels, both sewn together. Let's put them now wrong sides together. So these are just going to get put together like this. So you've got your lining there. There's my hole for my handle. And then on the other side we have got a lovely printed panel with the pockets. So just kind of line those up, take your time, make sure that everything's lining up nicely. Check that your handle hole seems to be in the right place. And if it's not, no problem, we can just do a little bit of unpicking, but I can see that that is matching up there nicely. So once you've matched those together, just peel that back. And what we're going to do is we're just going to sew together the seam allowances. So we just want to grab these seam allowances here and clip them together. And then we're going to sew them together just because that will keep everything together nicely. And that's the advantage as well of having a slightly bigger seam allowance. And again, you might find that your lining extends a little bit beyond your outer fabric because the process of quilting it will have drawn the fabric in a bit. So don't worry. I just match those seam allowances up with a few clips, and then we will just come over to our sewing machine. We want to keep everything out of the way, and we're only going to sew down here, just sewing together the seam allowances on that side, and then we're going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. So I've just popped that under my machine. So it's just the seam allowance that I've got there, and everything else is pushed towards the side. I've lined up the edge of my foot with the initial stitch line. All we're doing is securing these edges together to keep everything nice and secured together. And I don't have to leave a gap because all I'm doing is sewing the seam allowance, so I can sew all the way across. There you go, so you can see that that seam allowance is sewn together. Now there's where I stopped sewing for my handle gap. So the handle gap is still there, it's only the seam allowance that's sewn together. The same process would be used if you're kind of sewing a keyhole, say for example into a waistband for a tie to be threaded through. You've still got your hole there, but it's just that the seam allowances are sewn together. So if I now just do the same on the other side, so I can just peel back that lining, whoops, and then do the other side. So I've now got the seam allowance and the fabric for the other side. I can use those clips that I've got there to clip that together. And once again, I'll just sew all the way down. So this is where it's important as well that you are consistent with your seam allowances as well, because they should therefore match up. And I'll just do the same again. So open everything back up, give everything a nice press. And now with everything sitting nice and flat, we'll just put a few clips around the outer edges to hold everything together. So don't worry if there's a bit of a mismatch anywhere, because we can trim everything back. What you don't want is any wrinkles in your cover here. So just pin those layers together with everything sitting how you want it. And you can give it a press as well. So with everything secured nicely in place, if I turn that round, you'll see that that's also sitting nice and flat. Now my top edge here, I have got a bit of excess lining. That's fine, I can trim that off afterwards. That often happens just because the quilt panel shrinks a bit. That's not a problem. But everything's sitting nice and flat. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to do a top stitch around our handle hole. So I've got my handle hole there, which goes through both layers. And I just want to finish that detail off and neaten it off just by stitching all the way around it. My machine cover has a white background print on the front, and on the lining I've got this peacock kingfisher colour. So what I can do is I can just switch my bobbin over so that I've got white thread on the top and that kingfisher colour on the bottom before sewing. That means that my stitches on the top will match my fabric on the top, and my stitches on the bottom will match my lining. I'm approaching the end of my handle opening there, so I'll just lift my foot, go a few stitches beyond, and then I'll lift my foot with the needle down, swivel things round, and then come round and then go back in the other direction. There we go. Same when I come to the other side. Just go a few stitches beyond the opening, swivel round, come back down, round again, and then come back to where I started and do a little back stitch. So there's our stitch line there on the top, and you can see that on the reverse it has the turquoise colour thread. So the next thing we want to do is just to come round on the just within the seam allowance, right round the edge of our machine cover, and just stitch all those layers together just to hold it together. So we'll just work as close to the edge as we can. These stitches are designed to just hold everything together, and they won't be seen. Whoops, Daisy, caught a thread there. They won't be seen in your final machine cover. These will all get covered up by the binding at the edge, but it just helps if we can secure all those layers together before the next step. So just come all the way around the outside edge, pivoting at the corners. So now that you've done that and you've stitched all the way around, you can just trim off any excess fabric. We want to just make everything nice and true. So I'm using my rotary cutter and my ruler, but you could use scissors as well. And what we want to do is we just want to make sure that these corners are nice and square, and we just want to chop off anything that's kind of coming out over the edges. Don't get too happy with your trimming, and we don't want to kind of end up slicing away too much, but you just want to give ourselves a really crisp edge so that when we come to add the binding, it will look a lot better and it'll be a lot easier. Now you can see that on this edge I've got an extra bit of lining. I'll just get rid of that now. So that's all trimmed and looking lovely and neat. Now before we sew on our binding, we're just going to attach our sewing machine ties. So let's make those first, then we'll attach them, then we'll bind the edge of our cover. I've got my 4 ties here, and what I want to do first of all is just press in the end by about 1 centimetre. I'm going to do the same with each one. Oops. And then I want to fold that in half. So I'm folding it in half lengthways with wrong sides together. And I can open that back up, then press the raw edge into the middle. I'll do that on both sides. And then fold it in half again. And then once you've pressed that, you can just hold that together with, oops Daisy, with some clips. We're just going to sew along the open edge and along the end to create the tie. So repeat the pressing with all 4, and then we're going to go over to the machine to sew them up. Now sew these up, we're going to sew all the way along the open edge and then along the end. So I'll take that clip off there, there's my open edge. And I just want to sew right near to the edge. If your machine, if it's kind of gets tangled up at the beginning, then one trick is to start in the middle somewhere and work your way back and then work your way back. If your machine starts to chew things up a bit, because it is quite a narrow strap that we're working with here. So I'm not really using anything to guide me, I'm just doing it by eye. And when you come to the end here, just you know, be a bit careful, tuck it in. A few stitches forward and a few stitches back. And I'm going to have to trim off those thread tails, but that's stitched along the end there and all the way along the length of my tie. So I will do that for all 4. All 4 ties are sewn. If you take your cover and look at the wrong side, we're now just going to clip the ties to the cover and just baste them in place, ready for when we're going to put the put the binding around the edge. Now I found that if I measure 17 centimetres down from that seam there, and that is where the top of my tie goes, I find that that's a good position. And you might find that your sewing machine is slightly different, but let's start off by, actually I'll do it with the thread at the bottom of the tie. Just keep consistent, so I've got my stitch line there at the bottom. Just looks nicer. Just whatever you do, make sure it's consistent. So yeah, I'm going to measure 17 centimetres down from that seam to the top of my tie, and I want to do that on all 4 sides. Now once you've done that, you can then try it on your machine again, and you might want to wiggle those ties a bit further up or a bit further down to suit your particular make and model of machine. But I find that that works for me. So once those are all clipped in place, we're just going to do a few stitches just to hold them. It's much easier if they're just stitched on, then we don't have to worry about them when we are putting on our binding in the next step. So just go a few stitches forward and a few stitches back, just within the seam allowance there, just to hold that in place, so that's not going anywhere now when we attach our binding. And I just repeat that for all 4. Just make sure that they're nice and at right angles. You don't want it going off at a diagonal. And of course we're sewing them to the lining side.